Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Film Score podcast, and Happy New Year. My first guest of 2022 is the composer, orchestrator, and score supervisor, Catherine Joy. She's also the founder of the music production company Joy Music House, and is the president of the Alliance for Women Film Composers, a group that I'm a big fan of, particularly because of the work that it does for women film composers across the world. You might know some of Catherine's work on projects like Wild Wild Country, Minari, and Homecoming. And Minari in particular has been one of my favorite scores of recent years, a score that was composed by Emile Mosseri. This is actually an interview that we conducted back in August of 2021, and it's just taken me a little while to get it out the door. So a few of the references we make, particularly I think to the Oscar nominees, are very dated. Of course, you can find more information about Catherine on social media or on her website, and I recommend checking out some of her music as well. She's done quite a few really good orchestral scores in particular. Now, I hope that you all have a great start to the new year, and I can promise there's a lot of great interviews on the way. But until then, sit back and I hope you enjoy. Catherine, I'm so glad you're able to join me today. How have you been doing?
I'm really well, thanks. Thank you
Good.
for having me.
Yeah, of course. So it looks like your 2020, 2021 have been pretty busy. A lot of documentary work, especially, coming through the door.
Yeah, it actually, when 2020 and everything hit, we had just had a really busy period, especially the Joy Music House. So it's weird to say this, but I was a little grateful for the slowdown, just to have a moment to breathe. But actually work kept coming in. I think the biggest thing for 2020 was Potato Dreams of America, which is actually narrative. It's a narrative feature film, but it's a biopic. It's based on the life of the director and writer Wes Hurley, and that's Potato Dreams of America. It was like one of the bigger things of 2020 that I took on, but I feel like everything I did in 2020, there was actually like more time to kind of musically explore and just be more in the project. And also it was especially a time where you kind of wanted to crawl into a project and stay there and forget about everything that was happening outside your door for a little bit. So yeah, it's, work has been steady and I've been so incredibly grateful for that.
That's great. And I'm glad you mentioned Potato Dreams of America, because I was watching a few clips that you have up on, I think it's on your Vimeo channel.
Yeah, that's right.
The recording of that seemed kind of weird because most of it is recording a socially distanced orchestra, but then there are a few instruments that are recorded remotely as well.
Yeah.
How did you make that all merge together to sound fairly seamless?
Absolutely. It's a great question. Well, a lot of people were recording everything remotely during 2020. I know that like Lovecraft Country, for instance, with Laura Cartman and Raphael Sadiq, they recorded like every single instrument separately and then merged them all together, which to me is absolutely terrifying. With Potato, it was a bit easier because Fames was still recording in Macedonia. They took I think a month off when they had their hardest hitting lockdown. I was recording the anime series Onyx Equinox with them on the day that Macedonia shut down.
Wow.
We were literally recording and they were like, the government just announced we're shut down. And I'm like, can we finish the session or do we have to stop right now? It was crazy. So they shut down for a month, but then they were able to come back and, it was a smaller ensemble, just 30 string players and everyone was masked, but they could still play together, which is wonderful. But then, yes, I did have my soloist recorded remotely. It was challenging, of course, because everyone's in a different room. My oboist was in her room and then my flutist was in her room, and then I recorded some vocal elements to Potato and I was in my room. But even when you're recording in normal situations, there's definitely often different rooms involved, or at least different times of the day. And I had been using, especially these soloists, I've been using them for remote recording even before the pandemic forced us into that situation. And they have a really good setup in their rooms. So, I mean, for the musicians that I worked with, they were already set up to remote record. I know a lot of other musicians that was, something they had to learn during the pandemic is how to prep their room, how to use Pro Tools, invest in the software and the hardware necessary to get a really good sound. It's been such an adventure. And then, of course, having a great engineer, Brian Taylor mixed Potato for me, and he really did a wonderful job. And he definitely has, a wealth of experience of recording people in different rooms. But even if we did, like, for instance, Joy Music House score produced Homecoming Season 2, which was scored by Emile Masseri. For that, we recorded a lot of the stuff at East West, but we were in 2 different rooms. Often we're moving between Studio 1 and 2. And then we recorded some stuff in his studio, in his ISO booth, and then we recorded some things, like some musicians have, like especially pianists or whatever, have set up in their own studio. So I think engineers always have to have that talent to kind of glue everything together and just make it sound like you're all in the same room together. But it was fun in that Potato video to show everyone in the different spaces, show the orchestra with masks. It's not something we're going to forget very readily, but in 10 years' time, it will definitely be something to look back on and watch and have PTSD,
Yeah, it was really cool having that up there because I had heard some stories of various remote recordings. I mean, in a lot of ways, it was unavoidable if you're doing that. But yeah, seeing those spliced together was...
Yeah.
I mean, it was a surprise for me because I'm looking at like, yeah, you see the 30-piece string ensemble there. Like, all right, this makes sense. And then it cuts to someone else who knows where at. I was like,
yeah.
Huh, caught me by surprise.
I love it.
So the frustrating thing about your answer is it raised a whole bunch of things that I want to jump on at once, but I can't.
We got time.
Yeah,
We're
exactly.
going through it.
So one of the big things was you were doing a lot of documentary work, and I know that prior to now, and prior to the last year or two, you've done quite a bit as well. Potato's a feature, scoring an anime, you've worked in other shows as well. What would you say the difference in approach of scoring is between those 2 or those 3 or 4 different types of mediums are?
Absolutely. Great question. I mean, I think the exciting thing about doc filmmaking these days is that it's really now accepted by the community at large, the audience. They're totally into docs, which is super exciting. And the documentary experience is becoming more and more cinematic. So we're really starting to blur the lines between documentary and narrative. And I think also documentary filmmaking has always been very guerrilla and kind of on the edge and exploratory. So, it's a fun space to be in. Of course, you often have the minimalist approach where you're constantly working under dialogue or under talking heads. And so you kind of have that more documentary music style, which I really enjoy doing. I find it really, really fun to do. And so I have no problem when filmmakers specifically want that kind of music. But it's not always the case. And I feel like, more and more the approaches are becoming very similar between documentary and narrative. There's more stuff to hit because they're getting more adventurous with their filmmaking style. A lot of documentary filmmakers now involve some sort of animation, or they're, really working on the cinematic shooting and just making sure that visually it's a lot more entertaining than just watching people talk. So at the end of the day, it's about storytelling. And I think the exciting thing for me about documentary storytelling, and it was the same with Potato because it's literally like 99.99% true, everything that you see in the film, is that you're telling someone's story. And it's such an honor to score that. I take a lot of pleasure in that. And, I try with documentary scoring to keep my game as stepped up and keep my musical approach as adventurous as I would in narrative. The latest project I just wrapped is called Women in the Front Seat, and it's about women motorbike riders. It was such a cool project to be a part of, partly because I'm a bit of a petrol head, as we say in Australia, or a gearhead, as you say here in the States. And so I was so psyched to do this film, and there was just, unlike a lot of documentaries, which are often just visually smaller, because you're shooting someone talking, or you're shooting like in a room, or the space that the camera is in is smaller, and the music has to complement that. You can't have like massive music in it when small things are happening on the screen. But with this motorbike documentary, there's a lot of visual shots. There's a lot of road shots, you know, and there's, you know, big bikes with like big energy. And I was excited to really jump on that. And, you know, I watch a lot of car and bike stuff. Like, you know, I was a big fan of Top Gear, despite the narcissism and sexism that's prevalent in that show. The car stuff and the bike stuff is awesome. And the humor is great. And, you know, I also love like Long Way Round and Long Way Down with Ewan McGregor and Charlie Boorman. And the Formula One series that's been on Netflix is just so much fun. And when you watch these, especially like higher produced car shows, they're musically epic. Even if you watch like car commercials, you know, they can be absolutely beautiful. And I wanted to bring that vibe to this documentary. And I managed to apply for the Real Change Diversity Initiative grant, which provides the music production money, essentially, that you can put into getting a live score. And so again, I got to do big strings with Fames, and I got to record a brass trio along with solo cello, which was Ro Rowan on cello, and electric guitar with Casey Trella from the band Dark Rooms. You know, we were able to create this like cinematic experience, and, you know, I tried to just push it as far as I could and making the music adventurous and bold to match what we were seeing on the screen. This is a very long way to say that I feel like, you know, every project you shouldn't, the only thing that should matter is just serving that story. It doesn't matter whether it's documentary or narrative. Just trying to find your edge and make it as exciting as possible as the picture will allow you to be. Of course, it's all about the movie, right? It's all about the story. But really dancing outside your comfort zone and trying to bring something musically exciting to that whole thing.
When talking about the epic sound that you get in some of those, I mean, F1 recently had like Brian Tyler write their theme. I mean, and that's someone who, like, what he does is just big blockbuster music. So it actually makes a lot of sense now as to like why they'd get a composer like him. But it's interesting, like winning the grant and having that give you the opportunity to, you know, hire more sections and develop that bigger sound. Without that, what would your approach have been instead? Would you still have tried to capture that bigger epic sound in a different way, or would it have been a bit of a different approach?
It just would have been more in the box, which, you know, samples allow you to do that more. It wouldn't have had the life, I think. For me also, I just live to be in the studio with real musicians because, I mean, that's where the learning and the growth happens as a composer. You know, I haven't written for a lot of brass. Recently, I've been score producing Untold for composer Brocker Way. It's a Netflix sports doc anthology that's being released every Tuesday. And Brocker has been doing a lot of brass stuff with it, like a really big brass section. And it's been like producing that for him has been a masterclass in brass work and really got me excited about those instruments. You know, I'm a string player, you know, and singer by training. And so I'm very comfortable and passionate about the world of strings. And I've always had a lot of woodwind players in my life. So, you know, I feel comfortable in that world, but brass was like a whole different thing. So that's why, you know, one reason why I was excited to go in that direction. I think as a composer, you're always doing this juggle with the budgets and seeing how far you can take the money. With a film like Potato, we really did that on a shoestring budget. So I made negative money on that project because I was like, I know this needs live strings. I will say with Potato, there's actually two composers because Potato is really two movies. It's like the section that's set in the USSR, which was scored by avant-garde composer Joshua Cole. Joshua runs this ensemble in Seattle called the Degenerate Art Ensemble, which I've been a fan of for years. And they're actually like doing performance art in Mexico City right now, you know, and so he has a very unique approach. He's not a film composer, he's a concert composer. And Wes wanted like a completely different sound in the USSR part of the film to America. And when they hit America, that's when I took over the scoring around the 30-minute mark of the film. And when he was growing up in Russia, he would watch movies like Pretty Woman or Curly Sue or Steel Magnolias. And that was the score. He wanted that kind of score. 90s, strings, woodwinds, melody forward. just, like a composer's dream to compose. I didn't quite believe him when he told me he wanted that score. So he actually didn't temp the film at all. So I ended up temping parts of Curly Sue and Steel Magnolias into the film just to be like, legitimately, this is what you want? You want this sound? And he was like, yes, that's it, exactly. Except for that portion, which you saw, the portion about Grace. And for that, he wanted a very different vibe. And he sent me samples of that, like piano and voice, and very like kind of a noir feel to it. When he told me all this, it was just clear to me that I needed the real thing. And I just needed to invest in the film, in my own score, because I knew this film was going to do big things. And as a composer, a lot of times, especially, at the first half of our career, I'd say you have to make those calls, which means you make no money initially. You keep the rights to your music, but you make no money on the front end. And it's a business decision. It's about investing in yourself and in your music and believing in the projects that you take on. That's a dance that you will be doing your entire composing life, I think, especially with the way budgets are going. That's why you shouldn't be in this for the money. You should be in it for the music, because every time I go into the studio, I just want to go back in, I just want to live there. And, I think life, and especially pandemics, teach you what's important in life. And for me, what's important is working with live musicians as much as possible. Also, like keeping their industry alive, their job alive. I don't want my musicians replaced with samples. I'm grateful for samples, and I'm grateful that I can mock things up and explore things with something somewhat close to reality. But there's nothing like working with the real thing. And so always finding a way. The musicians I work with know that whenever I have a budget, like they will be getting some of that budget. And so when I have situations where I have less budget, they invest in me, and so it's like creating this community where you're investing in each other and you're being fair to each other, but you also do each other a solid when the project calls for it. That's a big part of what I'm trying to do, is create community and create ways in which we help each other build a sustainable existence within this industry.
That's got to be such a difficult position to be in.
Yeah.
In one sense, there is a big upside to sample libraries, and especially, especially in the pandemic, or for younger composers who, are just starting out and like they're just experimenting and finding their sound and being able to work in tighter budgets. But on the other side, like I would imagine at least that just further puts the squeeze on budgets. It's like when, as electronic instruments were more prevalent, studios and productions are able to say, oh, well, a composer can actually do a lot of the same things on a tighter budget, so let's give them less.
Yeah. I think a big part of this is educating the studios and educating the moneymakers. I get the suits in every session I possibly can because I want them to experience what it's like to record with live instruments. I want them to hear the mock-up and then hear the real thing. A huge part of our job as composers is education. It's education to the suits and the money makers. It's education to the filmmakers about the scoring process and about the recording process, and about the time and the skill that goes into it. I remember I did a Netflix project, and we had the suits come on down and watch some of the session, and then we all had lunch together on the break, and they sat with the musicians, and they were just so excited about live music after that. It's frustrating and you can get angry about it, but coming to it from a point of education, and like people don't know what they don't know. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's up to us to be like, there's a reason why this is a good idea. And one project we did, I was score producing it for Drum and Lace and Ian Hopquist, who you've had on your podcast, and it was their documentary At the Heart of Gold. And one of these execs came with their kid, and their kid was like glued to the glass in the booth. Like it's the best experience. Like, let's train them young. I feel like everything in this world is a pendulum. Like politics, definitely a pendulum, and I feel like budgets is a pendulum too. We've seen it go back and forth if you look through the history of Hollywood between big budgets and small budgets, and I feel like we're actually in a pretty exciting place right now. I am seeing a lot of projects get excited about live score, and we now have concerts of scores that tour the world, of video game scores or movie scores, and that's a really positive place to be in. Like people can go and see a film they love with the score played by the orchestra in that town. I saw The Matrix performed by the Seattle Symphony Orchestra, and it was one of the best experiences of my life, and the house was packed, by people of all kinds and wearing all different kinds of things. You have your old people and your young people and everyone in between. And so I feel like there's definitely evidence that would make you despair, but there's plenty of evidence that gives you hope too, as to the future of live music. And I would encourage younger composers to be experiencing with audio, like at the very beginning of your career. I think samples can sometimes make us lazy composers, where we just spend all our time in MIDI and not be working with audio. And it's so important to record yourself and record your friends and understand the recording process, understand the process of working with a musician. I was doing a class with a film scoring class at a university. I'm gonna leave all the details, specifics out of this one. But I will say, a young man asked this question, and I almost it was crazy. But he's like, what do you do when you're recording a musician and they're just not getting it right? Like, how do you not like lose your cool with them and just like completely blow up at them? And I was like, okay. I was like, well, if you're recording a musician and they're not getting it right, there's a couple of reasons for that, and they're all your fault. So either you didn't write something that's playable on that instrument, and that is your fault. Or you wrote something that's playable, but you didn't notate it in a way that's readable. So they're struggling to read it and understand what you want, and that's your fault. Or you wrote something that is playable by someone, but you hired someone who doesn't have that skill level to play that thing, and that's your fault. So it's like as composers, our job not only to serve picture, but it's also to serve the musicians. And when they come and work on our music, it's our responsibility to create something that's playable, that makes sense musically. Our job is to set them up for success. And if they're not being successful, we've done something wrong. And that's a lesson I learned very early. And well, I think it's a lesson I kind of already knew, because I was a musician who had to play music that was put in front of me. A lot of composers who come to this purely through composition and purely through computer work and MIDI work, they don't have that experience. They don't know what it's like to sit in that chair with someone staring at you and play that piece of music. I sweat for my musicians when I'm so grateful that I'm never in that room. I'm so grateful to be in the booth. Women in the Front Seat, I did record some rhythm guitar. I had recorded it here in my apartment studio, and it tracked pretty well, but I was in the Pet Sound studio in East West, so I wanted to record it again because I knew it would sound better. And I was sweating and shaking, and I couldn't even get that final last clean strum because my hand was shaking so much. And I was like, how do they do it? How do they do it? It's incredible that they sit down with someone else's music and all that pressure and make it happen. So as a composer, you need to have boatloads of empathy and, make sure you do your job so that they can actually do theirs. And then the other great, samples are great. And I'm a big fan of samples. I use a ton of Spitfire stuff, especially, but everything. But there is so much cool stuff you can do with a piece of audio, especially if you have the Sound Toys package or something like that. And it's something that can create a really unique aspect to your sound, and being bold and exploratory with that right from the beginning. You can make something super interesting and unique, and that sounds totally high class. It sounds big budget because it's so special with very little. So there's always options.
That's one thing that I can really appreciate about some composers who that they're working in the box solely or almost entirely, but you'd never guess it.
Yeah.
But again, those are, I'd say in a lot of ways, few and far between, because it's such a skill into itself. But in one sense, I love that story about that student, because I've heard that exact story from the perspective of the player.
Yeah.
And they're just you get a piece of music and you look at it and you immediately know this is impossible to play. Like,
Yeah.
in one sense, at least it's the student asking that question, not someone who's been
Right.
composing for years being like, oh, I always blow up at my musicians because they can't play my music.
Right. Oh, horrifying.
Yeah, I could imagine it. A few things that have come up in some of the projects that you've been talking about is not just composing, but also score producing and orchestrating and score supervising.
Yeah.
And I think those are nuances that I don't think most people are really familiar with or would know what the differences are. So, would you mind taking a second to just explain the differences between those three compared to actually just sitting down and writing the score itself?
Absolutely. Well, and a lot of composers have to wear all of those hats themselves. Orchestrating, the term orchestrating, man, it's, everyone has like a different definition. I think back in the day, orchestrating was often like you would get like a piano line or piano and chords, and you would have to make it work. You would voice that out through the entire orchestra. That was your job. These days, orchestrating, what it means is that you get the DAW, the digital audio workstation file from the composer. That composer might be yourself. Composer self may be sending that file to orchestrator self. And then, you are pulling that out of the DAW and putting it into the notation software. I work in Sibelius, other people work in Finale or Dorico. Even in that process, people may think that is like lesser now, like less of a job than it used to be back in the day when you were going, from piano to full orchestra. But still, it's a lot of work with samples. There's so much you can do. And then often you have to take all of that and reinterpret it for live musicians. And there's a lot of decisions you have to make there. Some people work in a brass patch or a woodwind patch. What is Spitfire? Whatever company has created it out of an ensemble that usually isn't specified, or even if it is, you can't really tell who's playing what. And you have to make that decision. You have to take that notation and voice it out between whoever's being hired. And then as score supervisor or score producer, you're making the decision with the composer as to what ensemble is being hired, what brass ensemble are we going to have to, what woodwind ensemble. In addition to that, you're doing all the dynamics, all the articulations. You're maybe splitting that composition into a number of different passes, right? Like in this pass, we're going to get all the legato notes, and then we're going to do a different pass, and we'll get all the staccato or the pizzicato, making those kind of decisions about the recording process so that you can smoothly move from recording into mixing and setting your mixer up for success. And then all the while making sure that what's going to be captured with the live ensemble is going to be close enough to the mock-up where the director won't completely freak out when they hear the live because it doesn't sound anything like what they're used to. And another part of that decision-making is also, should we capture this with live? There's some stuff that you do with the patches that's really cool. A lot of sample companies create these different instruments that are manipulated live, orchestral moments, timbres, textures, and they've already done that with live players. Like it doesn't make any sense to recreate that with your live players. It's a waste of time and money. And so you're also making this decision about what should be recorded with live, what should be kept in the box, what needs to be bounced, what needs to be re-recorded. So that decision making is done by the orchestra and the orchestrator, and the score supervisor is often just overseeing all of that. How's the orchestration going? Has the contractor hired everyone? When is that recording dates? Just making sure that all these different jobs that happen in the music team of the composer, that they're all on track, that everyone's communicating with everyone, that you're going to get across the finish line on time. And then a score producer is the person who's running that scoring session. Score producing is something I do for a lot of the composers I collaborate with. We're both producing, they're sitting there, but they let me run the session. I'm usually the person communicating directly with the musicians. I'm communicating the composer's ideas, and I'm chatting with the composer in the booth and then communicating with the musicians. But I have a lot of experience running sessions, and so I'm good at interpreting what the composer wants to the musician, but also I'm good for advocating for the musicians to the composer and to the booth, and making sure that things are not being asked of them that are not possible or uncomfortable or not good for them in this hour, and maybe we should do it next hour after they have a 10 or something like that. That's really my favorite thing to do at this stage if I'm working with another composer. I've done a lot of score supervision and I've done a lot of orchestrating, but for me, I'm at the point where if I'm going to be collaborating with a different composer, I want to be with them at the session, like running that session for them. And the rest of the Joy Music House team is handling the orchestrating and the score supervision and the copying and, all of that. The printing and taping, all the glamorous work of music making in the film industry.
And so you segued this perfectly for me already, because those are all hats that you individually wear, but they're all hats that your company, the Joy Music House, also wears.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about what the Joy Music House is and does and why you decided to found it?
Absolutely. When I first came to LA, and even when I was still in Seattle was where I made the move from musician and composer to film composer. And I kind of grew up in the Seattle film community, which is a phenomenal and really just like a really wonderful film community. That's where I met Wes. Potato Dreams of America is a Seattle film. And so even then, I was doing a little bit of copying or even proofreading and just trying to get in the studio and see what's going on in there. And I worked on a few like Barbie scores for Mattel, which had amazing music, like Lucky Barbie. The scores I worked on were composed by B.C. Smith, orchestrated by Edgardo Simoni, who orchestrates a lot for, what's his name? The guy that does all the Tim Burton scores.
Danny Elfman.
Danny Elfman, right. Sorry, Danny. You're a very important person. I'm just really bad with names. So, that's really when I got the bug. And it's also when I realized what I'd always known is that, like the best thing to do is to be paid to learn. I didn't do a master's in film composition. I did a certificate program with Hami Man before he started his master's program. But the best education you can always get is by doing yourself and by watching other people do and being like, oh, I want to do it that way, or I totally don't want to do it that way. And then when I came to LA, I did the same thing. Like I was like an older person for my stage in my career. I was already mid-30s. But I told everyone I met through the Society of Composers and Lyricists or wherever, I was like, I'm down for whatever. You need someone to tape your parts, I'm down. You need someone to orchestrate, I'm down. You need a copyist, I'm down. So I just started working with a lot of composers while also building my own composition career. So there were like 2 tracks going parallel. And, I had been warned by a number of extremely successful composers, be careful about orchestrating or whatever, like you're going to be pigeonholed in that and then no one will hire you for a composer. And that always was a red flag for me, because usually the people that told me that had a lot of really big orchestrating credits that, some of them were union and still making the money. And I was just like, this is how you survived when you were younger in your career, and yet you're telling me not to do it? I don't get it. And then I was like, also like, these composers know me as an orchestrator, but my filmmakers know me as a composer. Like how I'm being portrayed is completely in my control. The gigs I work on, the gigs I tell people about, completely in my control. So I leaned into it and started doing more and more, and like word of mouth started getting around in the composer community here in LA that I was a reliable orchestrator and score supervisor. And as I was getting hired more and more, I needed more people to help me on projects. So I started hiring my composer friends to come and work with me. And it was really becoming a thing, but it was nothing that I ever advertised on my website, because I wanted my website just to be me as a composer, a really important part of my branding. Like even on social media, I was really selective about telling people about orchestrating gigs. So by the time I got to 2018, I had quite a large team working with me on these projects, and people would ask, like, do you have a website? Composers would ask when they wanted to hire me. And also, like, everyone on my team didn't have a lot of visibility because I was just being hired. And then I would bring on other people, but they weren't visible. I would get them credits on IMDb or whatever, but they weren't visible to everyone. So I started talking to, my other team members, Robinson Hobbs and Joe Carrillo, Hope Thal. I was said, how about we launch this as a company of composers that support other composers. So it's always composer first. And then I was like, if we give it a different name that's not my name, then everyone can be visible. We literally just like came up with this in my apartment and came up with the name. Joe came up with Joy Music, and Hope and her husband Caleb came up with House. You know, we came up with a logo, and I talked to all my previous clients and got their approval to be put on the roster as current clients of JMH. And we launched it. I did not think much of it at the time. I didn't realize I was launching a startup. You know, like for me, it was just kind of a rebranding. It was really an education in the power of branding. And it's something really for everyone to think about, because anyone who's a composer or anything in the music or film or creative industry is an entrepreneur, and branding is massively important. Having the brand of Joy Music House was incredibly successful. We went basically straight into doing a lot more studio projects, getting notoriety with the studios as being a reliable entity for them to partner their composers with. Our first year, I think Wild Wild Country had come out before we launched, but that won the Emmy. And then RBG and Love Gilder were also up for the Emmy for Best Score, which we also worked on. And then, of course, this last year, Minari was nominated for an Oscar, which was also a JMH score production. So it's been a really exciting ride. Everyone on the team, they're all phenomenal composers, and they have successful composers, you know, who have TV shows and all different kinds of things. And so, you know, it's a new thing. It's been a massive learning experience. It's been a great ride. And I think it's also been a real education for people about the fact that composers have teams, and what JMH can essentially be is an instant team for a composer who, like, unlike Brian Tyler or Danny Elfman or Bear McCreary or Blake Neely, they all have teams year round who are essentially salaried with them, but JMH can be an instant team for a composer who needs a team for a week or a day, you know, and work with that kind of budget limitation. It's been a really cool way to kind of educate the larger community about the reality of the music team and the reality that composers rarely work alone. There's always like a whole bunch of other people helping bring that score to life.
And I think that's so much the broader outside view is the normal person will think of someone like John Williams or Hans Zimmer and be like, well, they're in their black box creating everything, and then it's just recorded and then released into the world.
Yeah.
Not realizing that, I mean, like so many other aspects of a film production, for instance, that there are a million other pieces and people involved to make that happen. Like, I do appreciate that it's giving more visibility to all of it and giving more credit to all of the other people involved in the behind the scenes of what's already behind the scenes work.
And it's so important for this visibility. It will help with getting more realistic budgets. You know, when you have this kind of glorified image of the sole composer doing their thing by themselves, like, this is when the budgets kind of get screwed up, because, you know, like, if the production company is just hiring a composer, then they have a different view as opposed to a composer who needs an orchestrator and a copyist and a score producer and musicians. And so, you know, it's so important to get to this place where we are sharing credit and we are giving a true picture of the whole kind of life cycle and work cycle of score production. A lot of problems occur when you have this glorified composer mentality. That's when also a lot of toxic environment, bad behavior can creep into the equation too. You know, when you have the mentality of team, it's easier to have kind of a healthier work environment, you know, a more humble situation. I feel it's more possible. I think one thing that I've seen since I've moved to LA especially is a lot of just basic abuse of people who have been part of music teams and not recognized and not treated well and not given a path forward in their career. Like, they're just used and thrown out. And I hate that. And it's just, it's like this evil side of film scoring that no one often doesn't talk about and needs to go away. I'm on a committee that's run by the Society of Composers and Lyricists. It's an early career composers committee where we're trying to find ways to protect and take care of the younger composer community that are coming up through the ranks and make sure they're no longer put in a situation where they're underpaid and overworked and ignored and not given a path forward. A lot of change needs to happen in that area. And one thing I wanted to do at JMH is prove that you can treat people well, pay people well, give them a situation where they get experience. They do learn by doing and get paid to learn, and then can move on and have their own careers. And I wanted to prove to the world that it can happen, so no one gets away with doing it the shoddy way.
I mean, it's like almost comical you having to say that, to say like, oh, I want to prove that you can like treat people well and pay people like, what they should be paid. It's like,
I know
you shouldn't have to prove that, like especially in an industry like in film broadly, there's so much money involved.
Yeah,
that should just be normal. To not treat people bad and to pay people and to give them credit should already exist, and it's crazy that it doesn't.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah,
it really is. But when you have that almighty composer view, everything gets distorted, everything. So it has to go away.
Yeah, I agree.
That era is over.
And you know what? Good riddance.
Yeah, exactly.
And look, I realize now we're like somehow already running tight on time. But the other thing that I did want to talk about, and it relates to visibility and just things changing over time in positive ways, is your work in the Alliance for Women Film Composers. So can you talk about, quickly I guess, so I don't keep you all day, but can you talk about a little about some of the goals and the steps that group's taking?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've been involved with the Alliance since 2016, where I came on to help with the inaugural concert that we did in downtown LA, and then I was brought on as executive director, and then I was vice president, and now I'm president. So it's been quite the journey. It's been a fascinating ride for all of us because, all of us as women composers definitely would just prefer to be known as composers, but it became very clear to the founders, which is Miriam Cutler, Lolita Ritmanis, and Laura Cartman, and Chandler Poling, who's one of the PR guys of White Bear PR, which is a film composer PR company. It became very clear to them that, we had to step up and put together this organization because there were visibility and equality issues that had to be addressed. And it's uncomfortable having these conversations, but at this point in time, it's necessary. And after we were around for a few years, the Composer Diversity Collective started as well, which is another great organization of which I'm a member. You can be a member of both of our organizations, even if you're, a white dude. Like with the AWFC, you can be a supporting member. And with the CDC, you can be, I believe it's called a sponsoring member. The Alliance, we were very specific with the naming that it's for and not of. It's not a club of women composers. It's an organization that's a group of people together for the amplification and advocacy for women film composers. And it's been exciting. We have over 500 members. It's exciting this year that there's, a number of women nominated for Emmys. Lolita was shortlisted on the Oscar nominations this year too, which, is a good step forward. We still have a lot of work to do in that area. And it's not just about awards, it's about people working. And it's great nowadays that there's, there is a lot of women scoring TV shows and movies, but it's still is a journey, and I think the goal for me as president is just to continue to normalize the presence of women film composers and to encourage directors and production companies and studios to normalize the fact that when they have people pitching on a show, that half of the people that are pitching for the score are women. For me, it's not like you must hire women. It's you must give women a seat at the table and an opportunity to pitch. And then you choose who's best for the project. I get it. Making sure the women composers have an equal opportunity to have their music be heard and have those opportunities. It's so important. And it's fascinating to me because it it's still astounding to me that so many filmmakers are not aware of the existence of women composers. And I still see it all the time. I've just been working on this project with one studio, and the filmmakers are women. And there was a women composer on this project, which was great. But I was talking to the filmmakers after the dub, and they were like, "Oh, it's so good to meet you, because we struggled to find women film composers." And I'm just like, "How? How do you struggle? We have like a whole directory of them, like there's constant Twitter feeds where it's like, where are my women composers at?" And then it's just like a million responses of amazing women composers. So it's just a reminder to me constantly that we still have work to do, just to make it normal to see them in places where you're looking for them. And it's challenging because at the end of the day, a lot of hiring still happens by word of mouth, by knowing people. So it's tricky because I feel like there's just so many places where you need to make sure you're present. And it's just like, "Hi, we're here." It has to happen on the studio level, but it has to happen on the grassroots level. It has to happen in the schools, in the high schools, in the primary schools, in the colleges, in the universities. There's so much work to be done. And there's still a lot of work to be done to let young women know that this is an option for you. And my story is fascinating because, from a very young age, I knew musically the path I was on was not going to fit. My mom was a concert pianist. I was being trained as a violinist and a classical singer. I knew that was not my path. I was a square peg in a round hole, surrounded by amazing young concert musicians. And I knew that was not my path forward. And it took me such a long time to figure out that composing was it. And I realized that when I look back on my youth, I went to a girls' school where we were, it's a rich kids' school where I got a bunch of scholarships to go there. And it was all about women leadership. Like there was no, it was all about, as a woman, you could do anything. But when we studied composers, it was all dudes. Like when I looked around, there was no women composers or women conductors. It wasn't on the job list in the music world. And I knew women could be in the world of music, but that composer job wasn't on the list. And when I finally found it on the list, like a long time later in Seattle, I was like, "Oh, this is where I fit." If we'd studied women composers in school, in primary and high school, I think I would have figured it out a lot earlier, but the modeling wasn't there. The examples weren't there in my local orchestra. There's a lot of ground to cover, and there's a lot of work to do, but it's exciting. And I'm so grateful for, all the people in our organization, especially the dudes. It takes everyone to fix these issues of representation, not just the people that are being affected by it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it is heartening that you can see progress made even just in the last few years. But at the same time, like that story, and when I talk with Drum and Lace, like Sophie and I talked about some similar issues too, and she had something where she didn't even know that there were women film composers and women TV composers until she was like studying and came upon them. And then hearing that story of that production team being like, "Oh, we didn't even know, like we couldn't find women composers." It's like, that's crazy. It's crazy.
It's wild.
Because like,
it's
look,
wild.
I'll say like my first season, I don't know, I interviewed like 22 composers, and there were 4 women.
Yeah.
When I finished that, I was like, that's a problem. But you know how long it took me to find a bunch of women composers to talk to? Like 30 seconds, because I know that you're all out there. Like it's not hard to find.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think that's where you get to the difference of people talking about an issue, but in one sense, like finding about women film composers is not difficult. If you really want to find them, it doesn't take that long to realize like, well, there's a ton of you working right now, and there are quite a few historically as well, but you actually have to do that work.
Yeah, exactly.
It's frustrating that people still aren't necessarily doing it, but it's at least, I don't know, makes me more optimistic that, for instance, the Alliance exists to say, you know what, if you're not going to do the work, we're going to do all the groundwork for you, so you can just come on our site, look at the director, and be like, oh, okay, there's just a shitload. And if you really want to like get women at the table, it's not that hard.
Exactly. And I think we are getting close to the stage where people will find women composers in their community or who have worked on someone they know. It's just, we really want to get to that stage where people are naturally finding women composers in their community who've worked on previous projects. And it just, it takes, a lot of this stuff takes time too. And it's, we originally, when we first started the Alliance, we're like, we hope we won't have to exist in 10 years. And now we're realizing that's not possible. We need to stick around for a while because real change takes time. And we just got to hang in there. And in the meantime, just be, an active part of our wonderful composer community and supporting all the great young women who are coming up through the ranks and becoming that next generation of composers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on that note, it's like perfect way to end the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a great chat.
Well, I'm so glad you were able to join me. I appreciate it, and I told you before in emails that I'd heard so many great things and had some of my composer friends telling me I had to talk to you. So I'm glad we were finally able to get it scheduled and get it done.
Yeah, absolutely.